Have you ever wondered why, even after achieving everything you ever wanted, you still feel like something is missing? If the meaning of life truly exists, or if it's just an illusion we create to cope with the emptiness? And the most unsettling question of all, if everything ends in death, then what's the point of living? Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers in history, experienced this dilemma so intensely that it almost consumed him. Despite his fame, wealth, and a loving family, he found himself staring into an existential abyss that none of his achievements could fill. He wrote, "My life had come to a halt. I could breathe, walk, eat, sleep, but there was no life in me, and this wasn't just a passing crisis. It was a torment that made him wake up every morning without seeing any reason to keep going. His success didn't satisfy him. Philosophy gave him no answers. Science only made him feel even more insignificant. He was on the brink of absolute despair. But on his journey, Tolstoy made an unexpected discovery, a truth so simple that even he struggled to accept it. Something that wasn't found in books or in the speeches of intellectuals, but in the lives of those he least expected to learn from. This revelation changed his life, and it might change yours too. Now, let's dive into Tolstoy's mind and understand how a man who had everything realized he actually had nothing, and how he found a new reason to live. Leo Tolstoy had everything most people dream of achieving: fame, fortune, a loving family, and a literary legacy immortalized in works like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Intellectuals admired him. The people read his stories with passion. His name was already etched in history, but ironically, it was at the peak of his success that he found himself overwhelmed by unbearable anguish. There was something inside him that couldn't be filled by applause or recognition. The success he had achieved, instead of bringing him peace, only intensified the emptiness. Every morning he woke up with a suffocating feeling, as if he were being consumed by a recurring and terrifying thought. If everything ends in death, then why does nothing I've achieved make me happy? Tolstoy compared his existence to a traveler lost in a dark forest, desperately running from an invisible beast. The beast was death. He knew it was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. But he also realized something even more frightening. Everything he did to escape only seemed to postpone the inevitable. For many, success and a sense of purpose are practically synonymous. Society teaches us that achieving great things, gaining recognition, and building a legacy are the paths to a meaningful life. But what happens when you get there and discover that the feeling of emptiness remains? Or worse, when it intensifies? This was Tolstoy's most distressing revelation. He had followed the path everyone considered right, and at the end of it, he found only a vast silence. Nothing seemed enough. He realized that the happiness he sought always seemed to exist in the next goal. A new book, a new project, a new achievement. But whenever he reached what he wanted, the joy was temporary, like water slipping through his fingers. This frustration was devastating, not just because he couldn't find a purpose, but because he saw that this feeling was far more common than it seemed. He looked around and noticed that many of his intellectual and artistic friends were also drowning in a similar void. People who, on the outside, seemed to have everything under control, but on the inside, were collapsing. It was a silent suffering disguised as success. Tolstoy began to wonder, has life always been this way and I'm only now realizing it? This doubt led him into a cycle of obsessive reflection. He could no longer focus on his writing, found no pleasure in the activities he once loved, and even his family, the one thing he deeply valued, couldn't ease his anguish. The problem was simple. Time was passing, and more he felt he was losing his own life without truly living it. What if success was an illusion? What if everything he had built had no real meaning? Restlessness turned into despair when he realized that no matter what he did, the final destination was the same for everyone. Death, and not just his own. His legacy, his books, his influence, everything would one day disappear as well. If even the greatest civilizations in history had faded into oblivion, why would the life of a single man have any lasting significance? Success felt like a broken promise. The world had told him that once he achieved all of this, he would find fulfillment. But what he found instead was an ever-growing emptiness. And the worst part? Now that he had seen this truth, there was no going back. It was as if he had opened a door that could never be closed again. Doubt began to consume him. If everything he had pursued in life was an illusion, then where should he seek meaning? Philosophy? Science? Religion? Or was the only path simply accepting that life was an inexplicable absurdity? Without answers, Tolstoy embarked on a new quest. But what he didn't know was that this journey would take him into an even deeper abyss before he could find even the faintest trace of light. The emptiness inside Tolstoy was not something he could simply ignore. He needed answers, something that could rationally explain why life was worth living, why he should continue existing, even though he knew everything would end in death. And to find those answers, he did what any great intellectual would do. He delved into philosophy. Tolstoy believed that the greatest thinkers in human history must have faced the same anguish, and that somewhere, hidden within the pages of the great philosophical treatises, he would find a solution. So, he began his search. He read Plato, Aristotle, the existentialists, the skeptics, the rationalists. He sought explanations in science, ethics, morality, and logic. But to his surprise, the more he read, the more desperate he became. Philosophy, instead of offering relief, only deepened his crisis. Schopenhauer, for example, with his relentless pessimism, seemed to confirm Tolstoy's worst fears. Life was an endless cycle of suffering with no ultimate purpose. Kant, with his analysis of pure reason, showed that the meaning of life was not something that could be rationally proven. Nietzsche rejected any predefined concept of purpose and saw the search for meaning as nothing more than a human construct. None of this solved the problem. On the contrary, these ideas only reinforced the notion that existence was arbitrary, just a meaningless piece in a cosmic theater. Science was even more brutal. As he studied biology and physics, Tolstoy encountered an indifferent universe governed by cold, impersonal laws. Life, according to science, was nothing more than a combination of chemical processes and biological reactions, a cosmic accident with no intention or meaning. Death was not a transition, but simply the definitive end of everything we once were. This realization left Tolstoy feeling profoundly desolate. If reason, science, and philosophy could not provide a satisfying answer to the meaning of life, then where else could he look? He began to feel like a castaway adrift at sea, surrounded by answers that offered him no refuge. This anguish was not just intellectual, it was physical. Tolstoy began losing sleep, eating poorly, and withdrawing from his family. He would wake up in the middle of the night, overwhelmed by the existential terror of knowing that one day everything would vanish. His children would grow up, his grandchildren would be born, and then one day, no one would remember his name. All his efforts, all his work, his entire existence would become irrelevant in the face of time. And then came the question he feared the most. If none of this matters in the end, why keep going? Tolstoy could no longer escape this doubt. He began to think about suicide. In his book Confession, he admits that he had to hide ropes and avoid carrying weapons because he knew that if they were within reach, he might be tempted to end his own life. This wasn't drama. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was the logical conclusion he had reached. If life had no meaning and nothing he did had any real value, then continuing to live was a purposeless burden. But something inside him resisted, something he couldn't explain. Despite all his despair, he still couldn't fully accept that the meaning of life was an illusion. There was something in his intuition that prevented him from giving up. What was it? A survival instinct? An irrational fear of death? Or was it possible that life did have meaning, but he had been searching in the wrong places? Tolstoy didn't know the answer, but the mere fact that this doubt still existed, that he still couldn't accept death as the only possible conclusion, meant that his search was not over. He decided to look beyond philosophy, science, and intellectualism. If the greatest thinkers in the world couldn't give him an answer, maybe the solution lay elsewhere. Maybe, just maybe, he had been looking for meaning in the wrong places. And so he began to observe those who had never read Kant, Schopenhauer, or Nietzsche. Those who had no great fortunes, no fame, no recognition. Those who didn't spend hours immersed in philosophical questions, yet somehow seemed to live with a peace he had never felt. Tolstoy was about to discover something that would change his life forever. Tolstoy felt cornered. He had sought answers in philosophy, science, and logic, but nothing could ease his anguish. On the contrary, the more he reflected, the deeper his despair grew. It was as if life itself were revealing a truth he didn't want to accept. If everything ends in death, then nothing really matters. This idea began to consume him. He no longer saw meaning in writing, in taking care of his family, in continuing to live. Everything seemed like part of a purposeless cycle, a game everyone played just to avoid facing the obvious. He wrote, "Life is a cruel joke that ends in eternal silence." Little by little, hopelessness took over. He began to withdraw from everything that once gave him pleasure. He lost interest in his work, avoided deep conversations, and isolated himself whenever possible. But the most frightening part was when he started seriously considering the only logical way out of this dilemma, ending his own life. Tolstoy admitted in Confession that he had to hide ropes and avoid carrying weapons because the thought of suicide had become obsessive. He constantly found himself asking, why not just end it all now? It was a question that, with each passing day, became harder to ignore. And yet, something inside him resisted. Something inexplicable kept him from taking that final step. He didn't know exactly what it was, an instinct, an unconscious fear, or a truth he had yet to see. But that small hesitation was what kept him from total collapse. He realized that if there was still something inside him that didn't want to give up, then maybe his search wasn't over yet. If the answers of the philosophers had brought him no peace, and if suicide didn't seem like a real solution, then only one alternative remained: to seek meaning where he had never looked before. And so, Tolstoy began to observe the people around him in a different way. He started paying attention to those who, despite lacking wealth, fame, or knowledge, seemed to live without this torment. These people, peasants, laborers, farmers, did not struggle with the same existential anxieties. They didn't spend sleepless nights questioning the meaning of life. They simply lived, with simplicity, with acceptance. And somehow, they seemed more at peace than any great intellectual Tolstoy had ever known. This deeply intrigued him. How could someone who had nothing beyond the basics be more satisfied than he was? One of the most influential men in Russia? What did these people know that he didn't? Without realizing it, Tolstoy was about to uncover a truth that would forever change his understanding of the meaning of life. Tolstoy began observing those who had never read Kant, never debated Schopenhauer, and didn't concern themselves with Nietzsche's logic. The peasants, the humble workers, the artisans. People who, at first glance, seemed to live hard lives without luxuries or grand achievements. But unlike the intellectuals and nobles he knew, these people were not in despair. They woke up early, worked hard, and faced daily struggles, yet without the crushing weight of existential anguish. They weren't desperately searching for the meaning of life because they already seemed to be living within it. This intrigued Tolstoy. How could these people, who logically should feel an even greater despair about existence, live with such peace? How did they manage to move forward without getting lost in doubt? The answer came simply, but profoundly. They didn't think about the meaning of life. They lived it. Tolstoy realized that while he and other intellectuals tried to find meaning in the mind, these people found meaning in experience, in honest work, in family, in the natural cycles of life, in faith. They didn't need a rational theory to justify their existence. The simple fact that they were alive, that they were part of something greater than themselves, was enough. He began talking to peasants and noticed a pattern in their stories. None of them had the philosophical answers he was searching for, but they all had a quiet certainty, an acceptance of life that he had never experienced. They didn't need to prove that life had meaning, they simply trusted that it did. This changed everything for Tolstoy. For the first time, he began to suspect that maybe he had been looking for meaning in the wrong place. Perhaps the mistake was believing that the meaning of life was an equation to be solved, when in reality, it was something that could only be felt. And then another revelation emerged. Most of these people had something in common, something that Tolstoy had dismissed for much of his life. Faith. Their faith was not a theological debate or an abstract concept. It was something lived, a natural trust, a connection to something greater that transcended logic. They didn't question whether life had meaning because they simply and directly believed they were part of something bigger. Tolstoy began to realize that his own existential crisis stemmed from the fact that he demanded absolute proof of life's meaning. But what if such proof simply didn't exist? What if the meaning of life wasn't something to be discovered through reason, but rather something to be lived through surrender? This idea started to change the way he saw the world. For the first time in years, Tolstoy felt a glimpse of peace. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he began to understand that maybe he didn't need them. Maybe the mistake was in trying to control something that could never be controlled. And this thought led him to a new and decisive transformation. Tolstoy, the great rational thinker, the brilliant writer who had explored the human soul in his works, found himself faced with a truth he was reluctant to accept. Perhaps the meaning of life was not something to be proven, but something to be lived. Faith, which he had always considered an illusion for the naive, began to reveal itself as the only answer that made sense. But not a blind faith, imposed by dogmas or empty traditions. What Tolstoy saw in the peasants was a practical faith, a way of living that required no logical proof because it was sustained by experience itself. These people trusted life. They did not despair in the face of death because they saw their existence as part of something greater, something they did not need to fully understand to accept. Faith was not a theory for them, but a daily practice. It was in honest work, in dedication to family, in the simplicity of their lives. Tolstoy, who had read the greatest philosophers in history, realized that none of them had given him the peace that a simple peasant felt when waking up to work in the fields. This made him reflect. What if the search for an absolute meaning was what truly prevented people from finding peace? What if the mistake was in trying to reduce life to a logical equation when, in reality, life was a mystery to be lived, not solved? This thought transformed him. For the first time, Tolstoy began to consider that perhaps the true meaning of life was not in reason, but in surrender, in love, in connection with others, in accepting that there are things that cannot be explained, yet are still real. He realized that these people's happiness did not come from intellectual certainty, but from trust in life, from the acceptance that there is something beyond the ego, beyond vanity, beyond the need to be remembered or admired. Tolstoy wrote in Confession, "I lived searching for proof when all I needed was to trust. The answer had always been there, but I refused to see it." This realization was like a relief. He no longer needed to fight against the void. He no longer needed to prove that life had meaning, because deep down, he already felt it. All he had to do was stop resisting and simply live, and that was how he began his last great transformation. Tolstoy's discovery was not a sudden moment of enlightenment, but a slow and profound process. He realized that his life until then had been built on external achievements, fame, wealth, intellectual recognition, but none of these things had brought him peace. Now he understood that the true meaning of life lay in something much simpler, living authentically, loving without expecting rewards, and accepting existence without demanding that it have a logical justification. This realization changed everything. Tolstoy no longer wanted to be a nobleman, accumulate possessions, or write to impress the elite. He began rejecting everything he had once valued. He started wearing simple clothes, abandoned luxury, and attempted to give away his properties. But his transformation was not well received by everyone. His family, accustomed to aristocratic life, saw his new worldview as a threat. His wife, Sophia, was horrified by his decision to renounce wealth and embrace a life of simplicity. Their once solid marriage became a battleground between two opposing worlds. Tolstoy, however, was resolute. He devoted himself to humanitarian causes, helping peasants, advocating nonviolence, and preaching a life based on humility and compassion. He believed that love and faith were the only things capable of giving true meaning to life. The only meaning of life is to serve others and live with love. But his transformation did not bring him lasting peace. He still felt an internal conflict, a sense that despite his new convictions, he remained trapped in a world that did not share his vision. At 82, unable to endure the tension within his own home any longer, he made a radical decision. He fled. In the dead of night, Tolstoy left his estate and embarked on a journey with no clear destination. He wanted to distance himself from everything: money, family disputes, and society's expectations. He wished to spend his final days in complete simplicity as an ordinary man. But his body could no longer keep up with his will. During the journey, he fell gravely ill and was found at a small train station in Ostapovo. Surrounded by a few friends and strangers, he died there, far from the luxury he had once possessed. His end was symbolic. Tolstoy spent his life searching for answers, found peace in simplicity, yet his journey was marked by the conflict between the world he wanted to leave behind and the new path he chose to follow. His story leaves us with a question: are we searching for meaning in the wrong places? Could it be that the meaning of life is not found in fame, wealth, or recognition, but in the little things, in love, in compassion, in surrendering to the present moment? Tolstoy did not solve the mystery of life with words or theories. He discovered that meaning does not come from understanding life, but from living it fully, with love and purpose. Tolstoy's story is not just that of a great writer. It is the story of a man who dared to confront the greatest question of all. What is the meaning of life? He had everything society teaches us to desire: success, wealth, prestige. And yet, he felt a profound emptiness. When he sought answers in philosophy and science, he realized that logic alone could not fill the soul. But it was by observing peasants, humble workers, those who lived without great intellectual ambitions, that he saw something that would change his life. The meaning of existence is not found in the mind, but in experience. Peace does not come from theories or external achievements, but from the way we live in the present, from the connections we build, from the love we share. Tolstoy understood that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And so, we leave you with this reflection. Are we looking for meaning in the wrong places? Like Tolstoy, do we believe happiness will come after one more achievement, one more recognition, one more success? Or has the answer always been right in front of us, in the simplest things? Tolstoy spent his life searching for this answer, and in the end, he discovered that meaning does not need to be proven, only felt. Perhaps that is the true secret of life. If you've made it this far, congratulations. That means Tolstoy's journey has touched something inside you. Maybe an old doubt, maybe a restlessness you can't quite name yet. But now what? What do you do with this question? Tolstoy spent his life searching for an absolute answer, only to realize that maybe the mistake was in looking for a definitive meaning in the first place. What if the meaning of life isn't something to be found, but something to be lived? Something that doesn't need to be explained, just felt, in the small moments that often go unnoticed. Now let me ask you, what makes your life worth it? That's a question only you can answer. If this video made you reflect, don't keep that reflection to yourself. Share it with someone who might be going through the same struggle. Let's spread these ideas and open new conversations. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps bring more videos like this and ensures these discussions reach even more people. Now, if you think this story is over, think again. There are 2 videos on the screen right now that will leave you with even more questions. Or maybe with some unexpected answers. Pick one and continue this journey. But consider yourself warned. After watching, you might never see life the same way again. See you there.